and welcome to Ramadan 10 Project. It is a privilege and an absolute honor to be presenting Mehdi Hasan for the second year running, political director of the Huffington Post and presenter on Al Jazeera. Those are the few things he's known for. He's known for many other things. One of them notoriously is the Oxford debate, which how many views?
1.6 million, but they took it down. So close to 2 million.
Maybe you could share why, as to why they took it down. But we're very glad and honored. I don't want to take up too much of his time. He's had a long day, as all of us have. He used to leave by 7:25 exactly. So let's take up as much time to share with him. And as always, a massive and warm Ramadan 10 welcome to Mehdi Hasan, please. Thank you very much.
May the peace, mercy and blessings be upon us all tonight of God, of our Lord, in this very holy month. It's great to be back here. Not here, it was a different place last year. This is a much nicer place. We've upgraded, we've got t-shirts and a much better venue. So we're going up in the world. I will try, by the way, I can't use a phone, so I've got notes, but it keeps switching from landscape to that, so I don't have a locket. I will try and keep this short, and then we'll have a conversation, I hope, about life, maybe. I will keep it short, A, because I'm knackered. I don't know about you, but 20 odd days in, I'm still not used to these 19-hour epics. How long have we got left? Still a couple hours left to go. The last couple of hours are unprecedented. I have the pleasure of spending the rest of my evening till iftar with Melanie Phillips, talking about Gaza on the radio, which should be fun. I'll have to try not to break my fast while debating that subject. Look, it's a pleasure, it's my pleasure and my privilege, Omar gave me a very kind introduction, to be back here for the second year running in this very holy month of Ramadan, to talk to you all, to be here. It's very admirable, I would call noble, I would say selfless Ramadan tent project. This is David Cameron's big society in action, British Muslim style, some might say. This is proper community engagement. And you know, we British Muslims, I've always said this, I've said this for a while, I'll say it again, we need far more events like this, far more projects like this, far more. Is this actually even working? I don't know. Can I go without it? With it. People at the front say with it, that's certainly. And I genuinely believe we need far more events like this and far more projects, and my hat's off to all of you organisers. Because we meet at a time of hysteria, of hyperbole, of growing moral panic. Over the last few weeks, over the last few months, we've discovered that British Muslim extremists are taking over our schools, they're taking over our pizza restaurants, they're taking over our subway chains. Yes, the meatball marinara is under threat. And it's a real issue, it's a real talking point right now. I spend much of my time debating this subject because we have to be afraid, ladies and gentlemen, very afraid. That is the message that's coming out from some sections of the media and public life. And indeed, according to that prophet of our age, that wise man of wise men, Tony Blair, there is a direct link between the hand-chopping extremists in Mosul, Iraq, and the so-called Trojan horse extremists in Birmingham, England. Direct link, that was Tony Blair's claim a few weeks ago. That is what we heard from a man who once claimed that Saddam Hussein was 45 minutes away from blowing us all up. Now, let's be clear. There is an extremism problem in some schools in Britain, no doubt about it. I can reveal to you all tonight that there is a school that separates boys from girls completely, where an ideology of superiority is taught to those boys, where young boys are taught that they have the God-given right to rule over other people, where an exclusive and unbalanced version of history and culture is taught, where imperialism is defended and excused, where the school motto is in a foreign language and not in English, where a narrow and exclusive religious ethos is promoted. And guess what? I can reveal to you all that that school is a school that was attended by our Prime Minister, by the Mayor of London, by the Archbishop of Canterbury, because if we define extremism as all of these things, then Eton College is a pretty extreme place. Now, we can joke about these things, but yes, this is the debate that we find ourselves enmeshed in. Those of us who work in the media, those of you who have picked up a newspaper just yesterday and seen the stories about Peter Clark's report into extremism in some schools in Birmingham. There is a legitimate debate to be had about extremism. As British Muslims, we get asked about extremism all the time. In my view, I don't know about your view, feel free to disagree at the end when we have a chat. My view is there is a legitimate debate to be had about a very legitimate problem of extremism. But the problem is, the issue is, that it's out of control. We can talk about problems in certain schools or certain mosques, about certain things that are said by certain individuals. We can condemn it, we can abhor it, we can distance ourselves from it. But the wider issue is now totally out of control. So when you see a political magazine, a respected leading political magazine that is subscribed to by every member of the cabinet and shadow cabinet, The Spectator, with a Muslim child on the front page, holding a sword in one hand and a Quran in the other, under the headline, "Taught to Hate," you realize that this so-called debate is now out of control. It's completely gone to one extreme. It's now unacceptable. It's now dangerous. It's now, to coin a phrase, extreme in the way that this issue is dealt with, in the way that the anti-Muslim, anti-Islam climate in some parts of the media, in some parts of the country, is growing. And I have to say, that is despite the fact that the vast majority of our non-Muslim brothers and sisters in this country are not Islamophobic, are not prejudiced, are not bigoted, are not opposed to us. Let me be very clear. There is nowhere else in the world I would rather live than the UK. There is nowhere else in the world I would rather live as a Muslim than the UK, despite all of the problems and all of the issues in this country. Just a few weeks ago, for my sins, I'm not sure about any of you, but my 7-year-old daughter and I were waving a St. George's cross in front of our television as we urged on Rooney, Gerrard, Welbeck and the rest. The fact that it had no effect whatsoever on those players is a debate for another day about the failures of English football. But the point is this. I'm happy to have a debate about British values. I'm happy to have a debate about Islamic values. Because for me, there's very little difference between core British values, or what some people would call universal values, and Islamic values of freedom, of tolerance, of mutual respect, of the rule of law. What was it that Muhammad Abdu famously said, the Egyptian scholar, more than 100 years ago? He said, "I went to the west and I saw a lot of Islam but no Muslims. I came back to the east, I saw a lot of Muslims but no Islam." And I think of that quote when I look around the world today. I mean, I just look at what's going on in Muslim majority countries right now, plagued by violence, by sectarianism, by corruption, by misogyny. You look at the situation in Iraq, or Syria, or Bahrain, or Pakistan, or Afghanistan. I mean, let us pray for the people of those countries on nights like this, in a holy month like this. Let us donate to charities that support the poor victims in conflict zones, humanitarian zones, crisis zones, natural disaster zones across the Muslim majority world. But let us also please recognize at the same time that we are blessed to be living here in the UK, despite all its faults and its imperfections and its problems and its prejudices and, yes, the growing Islamophobia. Nevertheless, we are still blessed, in my view. The UKIP MEP and former Daily Express journalist Patrick O'Flynn, he once claimed in an article that the impact of Britain's Muslims is, quote, massively negative. First of all, can you imagine him using such a phrase about any other minority community? Such a generalizing, stereotyping, negative description. I can't. Second of all, really massively negative? Let's look at the positive contributions made by British Muslims to British society that tend to get overlooked by UKIP MEPs and Daily Express journalists. We Muslims, after all, as you and I know, are very much part of the fabric of the society, are very much integrated into this country that we call our home. For example, you turn on the radio in the morning, and you can now hear Nishal Hussain presenting the news on the Today programme, Britain's premier flagship news and current affairs programme, the Today programme. You switch on BBC Television News, you see people like Asad Ahmed and Riz Latif presenting on the news. You switch over to ITV, you see Raghi Omar presenting. You switch over to Channel 4 News, my good friend Fatima Manji presenting in a headscarf. Guess what? A woman went wearing a headscarf on television news and the world didn't come to an end. If you want to follow the general election campaign next year, You could watch Sky News, their new political editor, the new political editor of a channel run by Rupert Murdoch and his family and his clan, is called Faisal Islam. Yes, Islam. Shock, horror, that's the surname. Look at politics more broadly. Look at the world of Westminster down the road from here. On the Conservative front bench, you have not one but two cabinet members. You have Saeeda Varsi at the Foreign Office and Sajid Javid at the Department of Culture. You look at the Labour front bench. You have the Shadow Justice Secretary, the Shadow Minister for London, Sadiq Khan. You have the Shadow Treasury Minister, Shabana Mahmood. You have the Shadow Education Minister, Roshanara Ali. In the Tories, just on the Tories, you also have the leader of the European Tory group in Brussels, Sayed Kamal. You look at the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems have Majid Nawaz, but you can't have everything. You look across... Sorry, you couldn't... You couldn't... You look at the worlds of business and finance. You have household names, British Muslim entrepreneurs, Lord Noon, Sir Anwar Parvez, Parveen Varsi, good old James Khan of Dragon's Den fame, and many others helping to drive growth in the economy, helping to produce jobs, helping to contribute to growth. The Muslim Council of Britain recently did a report which found that British Muslims contribute more than £31 billion to the exchequer in this country. We hear a great deal about British Muslim communities living in poverty and unemployment, and there is undoubtedly a great deal of poverty and unemployment in British Muslim communities, but we don't hear so often about the fact that there are more than 10,000 Muslim millionaires in the UK. And so when you look at a restaurant like Pizza Express, it didn't go halal with its chicken because Italian restaurants have some secret fondness for Sharia law. It went halal because of good old-fashioned business reasons, financial reasons, commercial reasons, self-interest. Look at the world of sport. Less than 2 years ago, the entire country was chanting the name of a man named Muhammad. 2 years ago, Mo Farah was being cheered to the rafters as he won not one but 2 gold medals for Great Britain at the London Olympics. And when he was asked if he'd rather be representing Somalia than Team GB, he replied, "Not at all, mate. This is my country." British Muslims are civil servants, are doctors, are nurses, they're members of the police, they're members of the security services, they're members of the armed forces. And there's nothing new about our contribution to any of these particular walks of life, by the way. As the child of 2 Indian Muslim immigrants to the UK, it gives me great pride to say that of the 1.3 million Indians who volunteered to fight for the UK in World War I, 400,000 are estimated to have been Muslims. Among the British casualties recorded at the Menin Gate Memorial to the missing war dead for World War I in Belgium are Abdullah Khan, Ahmed Khan, Muhammad Aslam, Muhammad Uthman, and countless other names of Muslim men who fought and died. And it's not just Muslim men. How many of you have walked through Gordon Square Gardens, just round the corner from here? I was there the other day and saw the bronze bust of Noor Inayat Khan. Now you mention her name, and it's not just non-Muslims, but plenty of Muslims who say, Noor who? Noor Inayat Khan, who should be a British hero and a Muslim hero. The daughter of a Muslim, a Sufi Muslim teacher, who volunteered during World War II to go into Nazi-occupied France to obtain intelligence, to obtain information for British military intelligence, who was then captured behind enemy lines in France and brutally executed by the Nazis at the age of just 30. She's someone who is a British and a Muslim hero. And these heroes, these role models, these examples should not be airbrushed, should not be dropped from our shared history, because there is so much for all of us, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, to be proud of, to celebrate. And look, I said earlier there's been a lot of talk about British values and extremism and that whole, do you sign up to what it is that makes us British? And I would say that, you know what, there's nothing to be afraid of on this front. I'm happy to have that debate any day of the week with anyone. You look at all of the polling from YouGov, from Pew, from all of Gallup, all the other major pollsters who have polled on this subject, they all agree that British Muslims are more likely to say they are loyal to the UK than non-Muslim members of the British public. They're more likely to say that they identify with the UK. They're more likely to say that they're patriotic about the UK than their non-Muslim brothers and sisters. In fact, polls show that British Muslims are more likely to say they want to live in mixed areas with people of different faiths, different ethnic backgrounds than their non-Muslim British counterparts. Perhaps most impressively of all, something for us to be genuinely proud of, especially in this month of Ramadan, especially in an era when Muslims are so commonly and casually and routinely demonized and misrepresented in some sections of the press, in some sections of society. Something to be proud of is that all of the surveys and studies that have been done found that British Muslims are also more likely to give money in charity, and not just to Muslim charities, than members of any other faith community in the UK. That's something I would argue is something to be genuinely proud of. Of course, here's the key point. It's easy to talk the talk on charity. It's easy to say we're so charitable. It's much harder to walk the walk on charity. It's much harder to actually be the person who's doing the charitable giving, who's doing the charitable work, who's doing the charitable fundraising. My view is that it's incumbent upon all of us, especially in a month like this, a holy month of Ramadan, to do our bit in whatever shape or form for the poor, for the needy, for the orphans, for the widows, for the homeless, as groups, as projects, as initiatives like this one, the Ramadan tent, is so wonderfully doing for people who need it. Not just non-Muslims, not just Muslims, but non-Muslims and Muslims. Ramadan tent, the reason I come along and support it 2 years running is because it's a project that's run largely by British Muslims, but not only for British Muslims. It's based on what are British and Muslim values: compassion, solidarity, community, selflessness. Here is a group, a project, an innovative initiative, outward looking, building bridges between Muslims and non-Muslims at a time when people are trying to burn down those bridges. It's something I'm very proud to support, and something we should all support. The Quran says in Surah number 2, those who in charity spend of their goods by night and by day, in secret and in public, shall have their reward with their Lord. On them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve. In these nights of Ramadan, in these evenings, in these days, we get to give, not grieve. And we get, in my opinion, to show off the best of British values and Muslim values. And that's why I came here tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mehdi. I don't know what to follow up with that, to be honest. It's a very, very powerful speech. You covered pretty much every talking point there is possible. And we are quite privileged and quite, we are humbled and proud to actually have someone like Mehdi, who, as a British Muslim, a lot of British Muslims living in the UK can look up to and see as a sort of a sense of pride that we look up to here in the UK and internationally. So believe you me, I'm sure you know, but I mean, most of our peers and colleagues across the globe, not just in the UK, take real sense of pride in the words you do and the stance that you make in many talking points. So a round of applause really to Mehdi. Thank you very much.